now we will move to one of the recent developments, a positive development for a change. Luba Fein and Anna Zobnina will be talking about the European Parliament's resolution on prostitution and its impact on women's rights, which is a resolution that supports granting aid to victims of the sex industry, survivors of prostitution, and holding sex buyers and pimps accountable. This will be a presentation in two parts. Luba Fein, who is a member of the Sex Trade Lead in Filia UK, she will be discussing the importance of the resolution for the global fight against the sex industry and in favor of the Nordic model for fighting prostitution. And Anna Zobnina, director of the European Network of Migrant Women, expert in male violence against women, with a specific focus on migrant and refugee women, she will be giving us an overview of the resolution, the context in which it was adopted, its meaning in the wider human rights instruments at the global, at European level. So welcome both of you, and Luba, whenever you're ready, thank you very much.
My name is Luba Fein. I am a sex trade abolitionist from Israel. During the last 20 years, I have been fighting the sex trade in my country. 5 years ago, after my country finally banned the pain for sex, I enthusiastically joined the same battle globally. And I met there many amazing women who are there, including Anna Zobnina. So today, Anna Zobnina and I came here to talk about one of the recent feminist achievements in the struggle against prostitution, the European Parliament's resolution on prostitution, which supports the main principles of the Nordic model. We will explain today what the Nordic model is, why it is so crucial for Europe, and why does the European Parliament's resolution stand for. So I will explain what the Nordic model is and why do we need it so bad globally and not just in several countries. So we feminists know very well that prostitution is violent, exploitative, and extremely dangerous for vulnerable women. According to Israeli data, the users of aid services for women in prostitution have numerous mental health challenges. 25% have experienced psychiatric hospitalizations. 31% have attempted suicide, 50% suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and other 40% have different mental illness. Maybe Israeli data is exceptional, it is not. In groundbreaking research, Melissa Farley and her colleagues interviewed 854 people in prostitution from 9 countries, and they found out that 71% of those people were physically assaulted in prostitution, 63% were raped, and 68% had PTSD. In a study by Janice Raymond and her colleagues of prostituted women in 3 countries, they found that 30% of Filipino women, 33% of Russian women, and 77% of US women reported head injuries. This horror should be stopped, but how? Broadly speaking, there are 3 different legal models globally. Prohibitionism claims that prostitutes, women in prostitution, are harmful to the society. They either criminalize anyone involved in prostitution, especially the women, or single out the sex buyers. And this model is implemented in most parts of the US, Asia, and Africa. Another model is decriminalization or legalization. This model claims that the sex trade can be less harmful or not harmful at all if adequately regulated. This model exists in Germany, New Zealand, and some parts of Australia, as well as the Netherlands, Switzerland, and recently also Belgium. The last one is abolitionism, the Nordic model, which we support. It claims that the sex trade is inherently violent and thus should be abolished. The main principles behind the Nordic model are as following. The purchase of sex should be prohibited. Profiting from prostitution, another person also should be prohibited. But women in prostitution or people in prostitution are victims who should get help to exit the sex trade. This model is enforced in 8 countries. The first was Sweden in 1999, and the last was Israel in 2020, and we hope for more. So I won't discuss prohibitionism today because it is a feminist meeting and not a single feminist supports it. No feminist believes that women in prostitution should be criminalized. This model is also becoming less and less popular in Europe and the OECD. The real global struggle now is between the supporters of legal brothels and the supporters of the Nordic model, like us. So, okay, legalization and decriminalization, we often use both terms. They're basically the same in implementation. They make the brothels legal. I will explain what is Nordic model. However, the underlying ideology is different. The idea behind the legalization is that we cannot eliminate the sex trade. So we will let the state supervise it and make it less harmful, maybe less dangerous. The ideology behind the decriminalization is different. It suggests that the sex trade is not inherently harmful. Only the legal framework can be harmful. The stigma harms women, the police harms women, but the pimps and the sex buyers are not necessarily bad. Once we treat prostitution as a normal job and running a brothel is a normal business, all the violence, most of it will stop. Okay? Not okay. It is interesting to say that in recent decades, there has been a change in the rhetoric related to the sex industry. 3 decades ago, we mainly heard cold liberal arguments, such as women choose to be prostitutes, it's their business, it doesn't concern me. But in recent decades, a pseudo-feminist rhetoric has been born to defend the sex industry. Those who use it say, we know that some women enter prostitution because of the scarcity of alternatives, but we must respect their choice. These women have agency. Who are we to decide for them? So they support pimps selling women to sex buyers and make billions, but it is simply because they respect women. There are no other reasons. So I must point out here that prostitution does not exist because some women chose it. It seems understandable to me, but I also hear feminist women say that if we give women more opportunities, there will be no prostitution. So this is simply not true. If we understand that prostitution is violence, we know that it is impossible to choose it. But even if you pretend that prostitution is work, there is not a single industry in the world that exists because the workers want it. Industries are driven by demand, by producers, by marketers, but never by workers. However, we also do not believe that legal prostitution is better. Even in theory, even if perfectly implemented, decriminalization cannot eliminate the inherent violence of prostitution as a practice. Prostitution is violent. Women do not want to be prostitutes, legal or illegal. When prostitution is legal, it is promoted and advertised. The demand is climbing up. The gap between supply and demand is expanding. How can we bridge the gap? By forcing more women in prostitution, by manipulating them. Supporters of legal brothels claim that in the countries where prostitution is decriminalized, the women in prostitution are in a better condition than in the Nordic model countries. But even this is a lie. Of course, even in the Nordic model countries, women in prostitution suffer, because you cannot turn prostitution into something good, just like you cannot turn rape or domestic violence into something. At most, we can reduce the dimensions of the phenomenon and help the victims. But what happens in the countries where prostitution is decriminalized? These countries have released almost no official reports on what happened since the brothels became legal there. We have no official reports from Australia, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Austria, Greece, and other countries. But let's address the little information we do have. In New Zealand, prostitution was decriminalized in 2003. In 2008, the official report was published. The report was written in collaboration with the organization that promoted the law, New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. So they left the cat to guard the cream. The findings of the report were praised. So like the model worked, everything is good. But when you read the report, you see fewer positive things. For example, the report states that a third of women in legal prostitution could not reject even one client a year. Just imagine, not even one client a year, a third of women in prostitution. Another 10% reported being punished for rejecting a sex buyer. So this is legally enforced rape. In addition, even according to very conservative estimates from New Zealand, the number of women in prostitution quadrupled during the law period. For more information, you can see the latest publications on the Nordic Model Now website. Now, Germany. 2 documents were published there by a former policeman, Helmut Sporer, in the last 2 years. According to Sporer, the vast majority of the population in prostitution in Germany are foreign women who do not want to be there. Still, they are unaware of their rights and are afraid to contact the authorities. In 2002, a year ago, a study by Melissa Farley and her colleagues showed that legal sex buyers in Germany are aware of coercion and violence against women, but they do not report it to authorities. Explain to me now, how are they not criminals? At the same time, we have some evidences of a decline in the sex industry under the Nordic model, like in Sweden and Norway. Israel has not yet published an official report, but we have information from organizations that help thousands of women to get out of prostitution yearly. These women have someone to ask for help. It is not enough, and we should not sit quietly, but it is an important step. But the problem is that enforcing the Nordic model in only a few countries, it is not enough. Look at the evaluation report of implementing the Nordic model in France. Look at that report. The report cites people in prostitution, mostly from economically unstable countries. Unfortunately, this report does not attempt to ask who operates all those people, but still, they say that they intend to move to Switzerland, where the brothels are legal, or to Spain, where it is illegal to hold brothels, but enforcement is feeble, but not stay in France, where the Nordic model is enforced. The Nordic model makes prostitution not profitable. However, when the Nordic model only exists in a few islands in the world, the crime routes move to other places, to the neighboring country, like from France to Spain. And this is our biggest problem in Europe. As far as some countries in Western Europe, like Germany, Holland, Switzerland, Belgium, have legal prostitution, implementing the Nordic model in Sweden, in Norway, or in France, it won't solve the legal original problem. As I said, legalization of prostitution does not make prostitution attractive to women or even bearable. Nobody wants to be in prostitution. So less vulnerable women from dominant economies of Europe, they can avoid it, and they do avoid it. Evidence tells that most women in prostitution in welfare countries in Europe are from Eastern Europe or from some other place in the global South. Some women imagine that impoverished women choose to be prostitutes rather than cashiers in a local supermarket, but this is a lie. Most women in prostitution are trafficked, forced, and conned. Pimps who operate in dominant economies of Europe with legal prostitution target very poor Eastern European women who are vulnerable, very naive, and do not know any foreign language. They sell those women lies. Some women do not know they are going to be prostituted. Others believe that prostitution is about a lot of money, yachts, luxury hotels, brands, and charming sex buyers. Remember that many of the less stable countries in Europe are part of the European Union, and their travel within the European Union is not checked at all. In some countries, such as Germany, it is legal to exploit them in prostitution. No one monitors their situation. These women come from poverty to the brothels of dominant economies of Europe. So not only do the women not know the language of the target country, they do not know their human rights. Most are deeply ashamed of their situation and would rather die than let their family know. This leaves them with no one to ask for help. Some women who do manage to escape prostitution and return home often have post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, alcohol and drug addiction, physical injuries, and severe dysfunction. However, no rehabilitation frameworks, adequate welfare services, comprehensive physical or mental treatment await them at home. The burden of treating the victims of the sex industry falls on economically and politically unstable countries who do not know how to do it. And that's why we needed so bad a resolution that calls to expand the sex purchase ban and help women to exit prostitution to every country in the world, starting with Europe.
I just want to emphasize again that prostitution. I have seen the chat even after my presentation. So it is very important to me to say that prostitution does not happen because women are poor or destitute or have fewer alternatives or maybe have sexual trauma from childhood. It happens because there are men who want to buy women and pimps who want to profit from the sex trade. No, sex trade does not happen because some women prostitute themselves, so they initiate it. It is not a prostitutes-driven industry. So it is very, very important. So for the sex trade to stop, we don't have to empower women or make women richer or more powerful or more aware of the situation. If every single woman in this world will go rich, Pimps and Jones will not sit down and say, oh shit, the women are rich now, so we will just go back home. They should be targeted, not women. They should be targeted. They feed this industry. They create this industry. They run this industry. Thank you.
Now, Anna Zobnina will explain the contents of the resolution that we hope will create this legal framework for women in the jurisdiction. Anna, whenever you're ready, thank you and welcome.
So I will take you through the resolution that Luba mentioned that was adopted by the European Parliament on the 40th of September. It's a very, very recent document and a very important one. And I understand that not everyone might know about the Nordic model. but also not everyone might know about what the European Parliament resolutions are and what power they have. So just to place it in a historic context, I will speak about the content of the resolution, what it says, but its legal roots. So every document, every legal document that the European Parliament adopts must have a legal basis. So it has to be derived either through European Union law, from European Union treaties, or it needs to have a connection with international law, maybe Council of Europe, or international law in the sense of United Nations. So the major legal connection here is actually CEDAW Article 6, CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And Article 6 deals specifically with prostitution, trafficking for prostitution, and sexual exploitation of others. That means pimping of other people. But since the convention, CEDAW Convention, deals with women specifically, so it is really about pimping and sexual exploitation of women in prostitution, and it recognizes it as a crime. So starting from this United Nations Convention Article 6, which also had a general recommendation based on the Article 6 in 2020, and it was General Recommendation 38, that explained to the states about the crimes of trafficking and how they are connected with the institution and the system of prostitution, and what kind of women are particularly vulnerable. So this is what CEDAW Committee did in 2020, starting from this and some other international instruments that we have, such as Palermo Protocol, but also previous resolutions of European Parliament and also European Union law. The resolution was adopted in the context of quite a strong campaign that several organizations had been doing for a number of months. This is just an example of the most kind of, the latest before the resolution. This is the action that we co-organized with a number of our partners. And you can see Luba there in this photo. These are the members of the network of our network, European Network of Migrant Women, but also our partners from Coalition for the Abolition of Prostitution and other organizations who did this action in front of the European Parliament and inside the European Parliament as well. Our network is, as the name stands, we're made of migrant and refugee women, and our position is very clear. It has been such since the foundation of the network. We will never accept prostitution as a job, which is very often offered to migrant women in Europe, and migrant women statistically constitute overwhelming majority of victims in prostitution, in some countries up to 100%. So this is the resolution itself. As the title stands, says, the resolution intends to look at the implications of various models, legal models on prostitution on women's rights. And Luba just took us through those different models. So we have quite contradictory and completely opposite models on prostitution in Europe. With some countries recognizing it as a job and other countries recognizing it as violence and others standing somewhere in between. So the idea of this resolution that was based on first investigation and a report was really to look into the impact, what happens with women's rights if you take prostitution and regulate it as a job like any other, or if you treat it as a form of violence and discrimination and inequality that basically is an outcome of unequal relationship between women and men. The resolution was adopted with quite a good majority, I would say, but there were some abstentions as well, and I will speak about a bit later. But now the main points of the resolution. So first of all, as I started my presentation, it placed this text in the historic tradition, the abolitionist tradition that we already have in the international instrument, starting with CEDAW Convention, Palermo Protocol, and EU fundamental law. So basically, it reaffirmed that in the international law, of course, sex work does not exist. So whatever is being quoted by some United Nations agencies here and there and reports, sometimes they use this expression sex work. In reality, not one single binding legal instrument at international level has the term sex work. So what is there is prostitution, exploitation of prostitution, meaning pimping, exploitation of others, exploitation in prostitution, trafficking for the purpose of exploitation of prostitution. These are the correct legal terms. Secondly, the resolution reaffirmed that prostitution is a form of violence. It doesn't specifically say male violence. This is the term that we use, that I use, but it would recognize women as being overwhelmingly impacted by this, and men as perpetrators, and as such, it is a form of male violence. It made it very clear, again, reaffirmed. It didn't invent it, because this affirmation was already in other conventions, including, by the way, 1949 Convention on Prostitution and Trafficking, which says that prostitution is incompatible with human dignity. The question of consent is irrelevant here. The question of whether somebody chooses or not, it's really a secondary kind of derailing conversation. At the bottom line, the understanding is that human sexuality, in this case, obviously women's sexuality, commodification of our bodies and of ourselves, because we're not separate from our bodies, commodification of our sexuality is incompatible with human dignity, and it is based on a number of legal cases, in the same way as we cannot consent and preserve our human dignity, which is primordial in the international human rights law. We cannot consent to slavery, for example. In the same way, there is no compatibility between human dignity and somebody consenting to prostitution. And this is on top of the fact that consent, of course, you know, some would argue that consent cannot be bought, and this is what the resolution says. But if we go even further, consent in some circumstances can be bought, it can be coerced. So the point is not the consent. Consent is not really particularly feminist concept or a term to start with. Of course, the resolution, because it looks on the impacts at the impact of prostitution on women's rights, it acknowledges that prostitution harms all women. It is not just those women who are exploited in prostitution. It is the impact on every woman and girl who, by the extension of just being women, become commodified and perceived as sexual objects by men who are the buyers. And of course, it has an impact on men who socialize themselves into understanding that every woman and every girl is for sale. The resolution also recognizes racist and classist nature of prostitution, which of course we can observe if we just study those women who are segregated in brothels or are being pimped in the street. It is overwhelmingly women either from migrant background and of course poor women. It speaks specifically about statistics, and that over 70% of victims of prostitution in Europe are migrant women, and it places the responsibility where it belongs, which is extremely important. It shifts the responsibility from the victim, from the person, woman in this case, who is exploited, onto buyers and third parties who profit from prostitution, the pimps. It calls to reduce demand for prostitution by criminalizing perpetrators, which is the Nordic model that Luba was talking about. And it absolutely demands to criminalize all those exploited in prostitution and to provide exit support program, trauma-informed reintegration, and access to fundamental rights. And I just want to give a few quotes. So the resolution can be found on the website of the European Parliament. It is translated in 24 official languages of the European Parliament, but here we're dealing with the original English version. So these are the actual quotes. How does it define the prostitution? You can find there the definition, and you can use it. It speaks, it equates prostitution with the form of violence. It makes a very clear point that yes, there are some who would argue that they chose to be prostituted, and there are those who argue that they consent, and the transaction that occurs within prostitution doesn't harm them, and they absolutely do not constitute the majority of those who represent the prostitution market. And the laws and the decisions in our society are usually taken on the basis of the majority, and particularly the most vulnerable among those who are affected by a specific problem. So yeah, this is, again, I already mentioned this, but this is a concrete quote. It says that prostitution is incompatible with the human dignity and the worth of a human person. It gives, actually the resolution is about 30 pages, and then it separates it thematically. So there is one chapter on demand, one chapter on those who are exploited in prostitution, one chapter how the prostitution is impacting the rights of women and girls, and what is in the EU terms is called gender equality. And I called it the equality between the sexes. It calls on the states to provide various programs, from prevention, obviously, to create the conditions that does not facilitate entry of women, and most vulnerable women, in prostitution, in particular with the emphasis on refugee women who are being trafficked and pimped, migrant women, poorer women, women who are coming out of care homes, and homeless women, those who are coming out of prison as well. So all of those vulnerable groups, to install the prevention programs, to reduce the demand, to introduce the programs that would reduce demand through education, but also to criminalize the buyers and the third parties. So yeah, it addresses specifically that those who are seeking to exchange sexual acts, and it uses correct terms, because very often the terms that are used in legal documents, they call it sexual services. We always argue against it. This resolution is good on language. It uses sexual acts rather than sex or sexual services. So yeah, it calls to criminalize every person, and we know that they are overwhelmingly men who are seeking to exchange sexual acts for remuneration. And it calls on the states to punish, to recognize as a criminal offense anybody who profits from prostitution. It also speaks about the harmful gender stereotypes and how it impacts the perception of women more generally, even outside of prostitution. Here I want to mention as well that, and this is a bigger issue that we have with practically all legal texts that come out of European institutions, but particularly European Parliament, there is a very great conflation between sex and gender overall in documents. But here, for example, for some reason absolutely unknown to me, when they list the factors of vulnerability, instead of listing sex as the first one, we have here gender identity. Now, this is a very big pity. We think the resolution is extremely important. We invite everyone to use it, to read it, to promote it. And this is quite a serious drawback in this document. There are other kind of weaknesses that we discovered, and this is in translation. So, for example, some of our colleagues, when they looked at the Spanish version of the document, they saw some discrepancies in the translation. So we're now trying to initiate the conversation with the translation unit of the European Parliament to kind of encourage them to correct the translation, but it's an ongoing conversation. Yeah, and here, this is something that I'd like to share, which I think could be interesting for those who are in Europe. So this is the resolution, these are the votes. So we can see, this is all the European Parliament. We can see that quite a number of parliamentarians simply decided not to turn up at the vote. And I think, in my understanding, this is because it's a controversial resolution. So they don't want to be caught in controversial acts, either voting against or for it. There was quite a large number of abstentions and 175 votes against. But however, we had 234 voting for the resolution. And if we look at the composition, so what we have, and by the way, just to make it clear, it's not my analysis. I copied it from another document from the colleagues, our colleagues who made it. But we have here, so PPE, this is quite a conservative group. So European Parliament has these political families. So in your country, it may be, for example, a member of parliament may belong to the left, but somehow they might end up in another political family in the European Parliament. So this is just the European Parliament political families compositions. So for example, Renew, which is quite a liberal European party. They traditionally are against, they go with the freedom of speech argument, and they would vote against any restrictions on the rights of men when it comes to male sexual behavior. And they were overwhelmingly against this resolution. Social Democrats, SNDs, overwhelmingly voted for it, and PPE, which is more conservative party, also supported the resolution. And then we had the far right parties, ECR and ID, and they voted against the resolution. Primarily, as we understand, their objection was because the resolution also speaks about sexual reproductive rights of exploited and prostitution women and their access to abortion. And purely because this was part of the resolution, they voted down the entire document. The European Parliament resolutions have no legally binding value. So this is not a law, unlike we have the directives that has to be transposed by every state within a certain deadline, and then European Commission can impose sanctions if there is a wrong transposition and so on. This is not a hard law. It's a soft law, effectively, but it is an important, first of all, it's a statement. Nobody, especially at the global level, there is an argument because we have Germany and Netherlands and a few other countries who legalize prostitution. So they all often describe European Union as a kind of a pioneer in legalizing prostitution. It is simply not true, and we have two strong European Parliament statements that the direction generally the European Union wants to go is the Nordic model. Now, if it's going to happen is another question, but yeah, it's more to be used as a advocacy and lobbying tool. You can use as a quotes in documents and saying that this is the position of the European Parliament, the only democratically elected body in the European Union. I just to make it very, very clear, right now, where we are with European Union documents, the conflation between sex and gender is given. You will not find one single legal document that actually clearly says sex and they mean sex. Sometimes they say sex disaggregated data, and this is because it's a specific term that is also kind of embedded in other legal documents, and like Eurostat works with it. So they can't get rid of it. They wouldn't say gender disaggregated data, but that's about it. The rest, whenever they mean sex, they say gender and they write it in legal documents. And then on top of this, when they mean gender, they can as well mean gender identity and whatever they want. So we are trying to, we're not legal, we don't have legal power, we're NGOs, civil society, so we're always trying to use the correct terms. But I think something to think about at the level of the European Union is to question the lawmaking bodies as to legitimacy of their using gender when they actually mean sex, because in the EU founding treaties, there is only sex, there is no gender. So we still have this, and they're trying to amend the treaties, but there is still sex and we can refer to it.